All right, hello and welcome everyone. My name is Caitlin Telly. I am the Communications Manager at Catholic Mobilizing Network, and I'm thrilled to be able to welcome you all to this webinar, 5 Lessons from Restorative Justice in the Time of COVID-19. We are having a couple people join us, well, more than a couple. We've got 164 and counting, so we're very excited to be joined by people all over the country who are interested in the lessons that restorative justice has to teach us during this challenging time. So I will, before I pass it over to our presenters, I will go through a couple housekeeping items and tips for you all when it comes to how to participate. The first thing I want to share is that all microphones are muted. So if you are experiencing any technical issues, you can communicate that with me directly using the chat function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. You can send me messages there. There will be time for questions after the main discussion. You can submit your questions using the Q&A feature. Again, that's at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom window. We ask that you submit them that way and not through the chat function. We're also going to ask that you don't use the raise hand feature from Zoom. There's just too many of us on the webinar today. We won't be able to respond to you if you communicate that way with us. The webinar is going to be no longer than an hour, and it is being recorded. We will be sending the recording out via email later on this evening. We'll also store the recording on our website so you can visit it in the future. At the beginning of the presentation, we're going to have 2 polling questions for you to fill out, and at the end, there will be a moment to fill out a brief evaluation. We deeply appreciate your feedback, but both of those polling and evaluation are optional. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenters for the day. Our first presenter is Sheryl Wilson. She is the director of the Kansas Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, also known as KIPCOR, and she is the president of the National Association for Community and Restorative Justice. Cheryl has been a practitioner, trainer, and educator in restorative justice for more than 15 years and has had the honor of working with individuals from around the world in her practice. She holds both a Bachelor of Science degree in Mediation and Communication Studies and a Restorative Justice-based Master of Liberal Studies degree from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Cheryl is also an incoming member to CMN's Board of Directors, which we are thrilled about. Our second presenter is Caitlin Morneau. She is the Director of Restorative Justice at Catholic Mobilizing Network, where she oversees program development that engages Catholics in transforming the criminal legal system through approaches to harm that foster healing and repair among all those impacted. Caitlin holds a master's in conflict transformation from the Center for Restorative Justice and Peace Building at the Eastern Mennonite University, and she was the lead adapter of CMN's Faith Formation Guide, Harm, Healing, and Human Dignity, A Catholic Encounter with Restorative Justice, which was published last year by Liturgical Press. So I won't take up any more of your time. I'm going to pass it over to Caitlin and Cheryl to start the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Welcome again to everyone on the line. As I look at my screen, we have 303 people with us and counting, which is just tremendous. We are overwhelmed by the response to this invitation. I'm going to say welcome and thank you especially to Cheryl for sharing your wisdom with us today. And in this time together, we wish to hold in prayer our brothers and sisters inside of prison who are especially at risk of infection and facing even more extreme isolation during this time. We also commemorate National Crime Victim Awareness Week and hold in prayer all those who have been impacted by harm in their own lives. We are also reflecting on how today is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and wish to just name and invite all of those remembrances into our time. So before we share about our work and reflection, we were hoping to learn a little bit more about you, now 312 people with us. And so we have 2 poll questions that will appear in a small box on your screen. And Caitlin will share those with us. Our first question is, how did you hear about this webinar? There are, thanks to all of our friends who shared about it in your networks. And some of those, in addition to CMN, we know that KIPCOR, the Congregation of St. Joseph, of whom we are a part of their ministry network, Restorative Justice Network of Catholic Campuses, the National Association of Community Restorative Justice, Monday Missives, Victim Survivor Resources, as well as other Catholic institutions or restorative justice organizations. So you could just take a moment, tell us how you heard about this webinar. A few more seconds. Hopefully folks have responded. All right, I think we can close that out and see what our results are. Let's see. All right, so lots of folks from CMN. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. That's so exciting to hear. All right, and next we'd like to, again, learn a little bit about you. So our next question is, how would you describe your primary role that connects you to restorative justice? And we recognize that many of us probably identify with multiple roles that are offered here. At this moment, we would ask you to select your primary one, whether that's as a victim or survivor of crime, a formerly incarcerated or justice involved person, a family member of someone who's justice involved, or a victim survivor of crime. Maybe you're working in the criminal legal system. Maybe you are a priest or minister or man or woman religious, staff at a Catholic diocese or nonprofit, involved in prison ministry, and a ministry leader in another area of your parish or community, restorative justice facilitator or practitioner, or an educator, administrator, or student at an educational institution. Hopefully folks have responded. And Caitlin, can you share the results with us? Wow. Wow, what an incredible group of folks we have with us. Thank you. Thank you for your service, for your ministry, and for all coming together here. That's fantastic. All right, well, if you are not familiar with Catholic Mobilizing Network, so sorry, this slide was supposed to be shared earlier. I'll keep rolling, sorry about that. Oh, hold on. Okay, there we go. So if you're not already familiar with Catholic Mobilizing Network, we are a national organization working to end the death penalty and promote restorative justice through education, advocacy, and prayer. And we do this in collaboration with dioceses, ministry groups, state coalitions, and people of faith and goodwill throughout the country. We stand firm in the belief that every person has inalienable dignity, no matter the harm they may have suffered or caused. As we mobilize to advance state-based and federal death penalty abolition and oppose scheduled execution, we also create opportunities for faith formation, story sharing, and network building that increases awareness and use of restorative practices among Catholic communities, ones that call for approaches to crime and harm that focus on healing people and relationships most impacted. So just briefly on about today's webinar, you know, I think our polls show us that we come together from a multitude of locations, experiences, and religious backgrounds, and yet we are connected. We're connected by this terrible disease, and we're connected by a commitment to a justice that heals. So early in this crisis, we at CMN felt within ourselves and our networks and communities a new depth of understanding about the power and need for restorative practices, such as circle process as one example. Our hope today is to illuminate the ways that these practices may not only help us endure this time, but also give life to such approaches in our communal and systemic responses to harm and crime going forward. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Cheryl. So Cheryl, thank you again for joining us and just being with us today. Will you tell us more about your restorative justice work at KIPCOR and NACRJ?
So Hello, everybody. I'm just so pleased to be here, and I'm just going to say up front, this is the most important event meeting I've ever attended in my slippers. So thank you for that. Um, I, um, I would just say, for the purposes of this time we have together, my earliest work had been more related to the criminal justice system. I trained to facilitate in cases between harm parties and those who had committed harm, and did that very fluidly in and outside of prisons. And one of the things that I began to notice, especially in my work with adults, is for many of them, they had not had certain things happen in their childhood. Many of them were overcoming childhood trauma, which we talk very, very openly about today. But in those days, I didn't hear as much about what people were dealing with, which led them to make the choices and having a life that eventually landed them in trouble with the law or incarcerated. And so as a result, I started to think, wow, it might be important to look at what happens early on and put our resources as practitioners in restorative justice toward our youth. And so I'm very, very grateful to be at KIPCOR, which that is one of the main ways that we do restorative justice work. Through our Restorative Schools Initiative, we are able to train at K-12 educators in restorative practices. And at KIPCOR, we have had the opportunity to train over 1,000 teachers in the state of Kansas. And we are continuing on that quest to grow restorative justice in that way. And then just also thinking about my work with NACRJ, I have been a part of this organization since its inception, and that is one of the things that has kind of undergirded my work, is just being connected with a network of people who are around the country and throughout the world who do restorative justice work. And we have been able to convene people at conferences and do amazing things. Just in the last conference that we held in Denver last summer, we had over 1,600 people convene around restorative justice. And we are having our next conference in Chicago next year in June. And we hope to see many more attend and be a part of a network where we can be what we need to be for each other in the work. So I'm so very grateful to have these connections that I have with great organizations, and ones that I feel like are making their mark in terms of the work in the state of Kansas and in this country. So I'm grateful to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm curious, kind of generally, before we dive into, what are these 5 key learnings we're thinking about right now? What's typically your response when someone says, Cheryl, what is restorative justice? And based on that response, what is stirring right now in you as a person of faith, as a restorative justice practitioner, particularly what it means to live restoratively in this time?
Well, in terms of what restorative justice is, in my shortest definition that I use often, is it's a way that we seek to repair harm in the aftermath of crime or wrongdoing. It doesn't have to be connected with a system in the ways that we can be restorative, but it is just, how do we look at whose responsibility it is and how collectively we can repair harm. It's not just on the person who committed the harm, but it's on the community that surrounded that situation in order for it to possibly be enabled to happen. And then it's also the walking with the person who's been harmed to make sure that their needs are met all throughout a process where people may come together face to face, or just to do the things that fix what people might identify as broken. And I would say for me, in terms of what is stirring in me, what is connecting me in terms of my faith, I would say I have never, and I'm looking back on the periods of time in my life, I've never prayed more than now. I consider myself to be someone who has walked in my Christian faith. I've tried to be faithful, and not always successfully, but one of the things that I maintain as something I don't excuse myself from is that the way that I connect with God does not have to be interrupted by where I live, who I'm with, my circumstances. And so in that, I'm using this as an opportunity to connect more and to I feel that heaviness of what is happening in the world. And we have never, in my life, had a time where the world has stopped. And so for me, it stirs so many emotions in me, and connecting to my faith and thinking about how that connects to living restoratively. I just think it's a time when I am examining in the ways that I might ask someone who is dealing with harm to deal with what is going on in my heart. What is it that I feel that I need to deal with and repair? And so, of course, all those things come to me because I've got time to pause. I've got time to think about who do I want to be when I come out of this? And so those are ways that I think about how that's what's stirring in me right now.
Absolutely. And I think that's an incredible transition. You know, I was reminded that in November, the USACB, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, came out with a pastoral letter against racism. And in it, they really remind the faithful that justice is about being in right relationship with God and with one another and with creation. And I think restorative justice really draws us particularly to think about what does it mean to live in right relationship with one another, but also knowing that our relationships with God, with one another, and with creation are interconnected with one another. And I think your reflections, particularly on prayer, I have been feeling similarly, and is probably the perfect segue into one of the first kind of reflections we wanted to think about together. And before I move into that, I'll just say, you know, we recognize that there are so many learnings and reflections that can be highlighted in this time. And these 5 simply offer a starting place for us to think about together. And so let's see if my slide will advance. Apologies. Okay, there we go. So the first thing we were thinking about is how this time is calling us to appreciate the beauty of ceremony, whether to you it's ceremony or ritual or prayer, and shared values. And I was reflecting on in circle process, we often open or close with some type of ceremony, whether that's a prayer or song, even silence, breathing. And then a group might name some values and guidelines that help us to honor one another's dignity during that time. And these are all important pieces to being able to talk about the difficult issues, right? And so I know for many of us Catholics, we are struggling with the inability to come together for Mass and other religious services in community with our faith communities. And so Cheryl, how do you see new opportunities for ceremony engaging or emerging in this time, and why are they important to a restorative justice process?
Well, I don't have for the purposes of talking about this, I don't know that ceremony plays that role, but ritual is definitely something that speaks to me. And I do believe that when we enter into a restorative practice, whatever it is that we're doing as practitioners, part of what comes to me is we have ways of doing work. We have ways of doing things in the ways of process. There are steps that we take in order to do some of the tasks that we do in a day. But if we are talking about practice and what we do in this work, there is a greater sense of being aware. Mindfulness is what I will call it. And in that, it's not about process, it's more about the practice of what it is at our core we are trying to translate in holding space. And so when I think about that and being mindful, I have to dismiss everything else that's going on. Like, for instance, just being on this call, there are a ton of things that happen in a day for us, with our work, with our families, with the world. And it can enter in very easily if we're not careful when we are trying to be there to hold space for others. And so one of the things I try very hard to do is I try to think about that in terms of my breathing, to transfer me out of what I was in, to set the stage and the tone for where I'm going in holding space, and taking myself out of that equation. And that does require some inner work, inner strength, faith, prayer, all those things kind of come into play. But if I can just focus on my breath, and sometimes for me, I don't have a lot of time. So if I can just take 3 deep breaths through the nose, out of the mouth, it puts me in that space of thinking about something greater than me. And for me, as a person of faith, that is one of the prayers that I pray is, God, let this be for them, whoever they are. And I am not a part of this. And help me in whatever ways that I can to support all the parties that are here, because that is my role in this time. Help me to not give in to the distractions that would confound me and make this about something else. And so in that way of just being mindful, I'm able to bring that to the practice and be fully engaged. And there's a way that many of us talk about it, is called being fully present. Mm-hmm. And when we are fully present, we're not thinking about what we're going to do next, what we're going to say next, and our agenda is completely on hold. And we're able to hold that space for others.
And I've so appreciated when I've gotten to be a participant in some of those processes, and that moment of kind of stepping into that, that prayer, that song, just that moment of centering is, I think, what helps to kind of set this time and space apart, to say we are doing this intentionally together, and this time is honored and is sacred. So thank you. Yeah. And I'll just share briefly my personal inspiration for this image of the dandelion is that my 2-year-old son is just adores flowers right now, and the dandelions are everywhere. And I remembered as a kid, you say, oh, blow the flower and make a wish. Well, now, especially in this time, we've been thinking about, okay, how can we not just make a wish, how can we lift up a prayer? How can we lift up an intention and be people for others in
Mhm.
even in those small moments? So absolutely.
Mhm.
Well, so then, if we are kind of thinking chronologically about then, what tends to happen next in a circle process, there's often a round of checking in with one another. And it tends to, again, I have the donkey here because he is carrying a weight. And so we are all carrying weights that we
Yeah.
bring to our interactions. And so checking in allows us to just unload a little bit, to help us be present, as you mentioned. And so I wonder, Cheryl, if you can just say more about why this checking in is important, and why is it important in a restorative process, and why is it important especially now during this pandemic in this time?
So the opportunity for the check-in, if we were in a circle process, for example, would be to take a temperature of where people are at in the circle. I think it's a little disingenuous when we have an agenda that we want to follow and we just go straight for the jugular and ask the critical question. When we don't know where people are coming from, where they've been, what they're carrying, as you mentioned, it's important, I think, to acknowledge what is with people, and for people to be well with this is where everyone is at, and it is okay. It's okay if someone's having a bad day. It's okay if hey, everything's going right. I think it's holding again, it's about holding the space, knowing all of these things with people. That's important, and especially when we're thinking about circle process. But I think in connection to how this fits into today and living restoratively in times of COVID-19, I think the reality is people are dying. And so when you say checking in, I want to know that you're okay. I want to know that you're safe. And for some, I want to know that you're still with us. There was a call that I made to a friend yesterday because I hadn't heard from her. I know she's okay, but it turned out that somebody in her life is not doing well. And when we know that about each other, we can be praying, we can be mindful, we can do what we can to support. And I think that is the reality. Um, I will say, on a funny note, somebody that's in my life that I probably check in with way too often is my mother. I believe she's listening. And she would say that she's under house arrest because there's three of us. I have two brothers, and we call her pretty much every few hours to check in. And she also has one of those Google products at her doorbell, so we can all see her coming and going every day. And she really feels like she's checked on. So anyway, but there are people in our lives where we know that it's important that we see how people are doing.
Absolutely. And I think how we're doing is then so wrapped up in, of course, our experiences and sharing stories about those experiences. And so one of the things that we're also reflecting on was this importance of being able to share judgment, to share stories, and then receive the stories of others without judgment. And of course, story sharing from the heart is core to restorative practices. And passing a talking piece can help to kind of honor one another's voices, allow the space. So Cheryl, why is this kind of story sharing so critical to a healing process, and both in the wake of harm and in living day to day right now?
I think that for me, I will say that the most important gift that I'm getting right now is hearing from people that I haven't heard from in who knows when, because we have time to be with each other in ways that we normally don't. So I've heard from people around the world, because things like this connect us from wherever we are. Being on a Zoom call, I can call anybody anywhere. So we're taking advantage of those opportunities. And I think hearing people talk about things in ways that they normally don't, because time has always been the limitation, it makes the times that I'm with people so much sweeter. And I think that is definitely something that we incorporate in our work as practitioners. Is for the first time, for many people who have experienced harm, if they're coming into contact with a practitioner for the first time doing restorative justice work, so restorative practices, there may not have ever been a time when they've been with someone where they've been able to fully just live through and process through on without someone asking a million questions, without someone telling them what's right or wrong about what they're sharing, but just hearing them and being connected to them. And again, that full presence of that other individual, just saying, I'm here for you. And whatever that looks like for you, again, it's taking oneself out of the equation, just like I talked about earlier about having that mindfulness time where you're taking yourself out of that to just be what you need to be for someone else and holding space. And I think what people share, I mean, it's a time where I believe people are putting their cards on the table, because for some, maybe they're seeing the reality of their own mortality for the first time. And we know now, for a long time, we were kind of convinced that, oh, the people who are passing away are probably of a certain age, or they're in these categories, and that excludes me. But now we know, we don't know enough about what this is to say that. Young people are passing away. People who are in these different groups are, with all the things that they're saying, everything is off the table now in terms of what could potentially happen. And so as a result, I think people are taking it, at least I'll say the people that are in my circles are taking it very seriously. I know there's still folks that we're just wondering, when they will get the memo that this is serious. But regardless, I think it's a time collectively when we are pausing, and we are taking the time to put things out there to the people that we know and trust in ways that maybe we never have before.
And, I'm reminded too of, and I hope this is okay, I remember in another one of our conversations, along that thread, saying, us kind of asking ourselves the questions of, what relationships do I need to make right in my life that I haven't? And what does it mean for me to be able to share a story of taking accountability for with someone who I've harmed, or being able to hear that story from someone else, as well as reach out in ways that may repair some of those relationships in our own lives. And I think I know for me, when I've had the opportunity to do that, it makes this work as it relates to particularly repairing harm in the context of crime, it just resonates that much more deeply. And it's a new sense of connection. So I thank you for shedding light on that.
Yeah.
And so with that kind of spanning out, one of the things that both restorative justice and Catholic social tradition prioritizes are the needs of the marginalized and vulnerable communities. It really implores us to ask, how are we responsible for one another? what may I need in this time, and what gifts and talents and resources do I have to share? And so I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on these questions and priorities and how they show up for you, both in your practice and during this pandemic.
One of the things that we know about restorative practices and the questions that we would ask is, whose responsibility is it when harm has occurred, or when, you know, there's wrongdoing happening? Whose responsibility is it? And I think it's easy right now. I'm going to just speak for myself. It is so easy to just be in my world because I've been asked to shutter in. I'm not supposed to interact with people closely. And so there's a way that we become way too introspective. And we can call people and all of that, but we don't really have to, quote unquote, take responsibility. And the thing is, we're not going to be called on it right now. I think that what is interesting is collectively as a people, we can see where there are marginalized communities already that are being impacted in huge ways by this virus. And many of them are communities of color. And one of the things that it strikes me as important is, what ways can I advocate? What ways can I use my voice in my community to not let people get left behind? What ways can I support if someone is a business owner that happens to be a person of color and that their business has suffered as a result? What ways can I sound the alarm with those people that I want to raise up and bring to the table with others? How can I do that? And so I think it's important to be what we can be for others who can't speak, or who aren't able to make those, to move through different communities as easily as we can. So I think it's important to not ignore what we're not called to do right now is go out and physically help people. So what can we do to sound the alarm in other ways?
Absolutely. I think, of course, all of these themes are interrelated with one another, but you know, we are also thinking about, because of this interconnectedness, because of this mutuality, that we have opportunities to create supportive spaces, even if we can't physically be together, supportive spaces to process trauma and make plans and hold one another accountable in these processes. And so, Cheryl, I wonder what collective supports or I wonder if you can just explain why collective supports and agreements can be so impactful in a restorative justice process, and how might we think about creating these kinds of environments for one another now and as we go forward?
Well, I would say supportive spaces. We are getting super creative with doing things virtually, aren't we? Mm-hmm. I know that for myself, some of the ways that I've experienced that is, I haven't given up circle practice at all. We found ways to do circles virtually and have very deep, rich discussion without actually sitting in a circle, but the whole spirit and the values and all of the ritual, all of those things are still present, and we are fully present with each other. And I would just say, even beyond what we normally would experience if we were in person, I think we're a lot more able to do circle by being more present with each other than less in this time. Technology isn't perfect, but I think because it's not perfect, and we know this is precious, to be able to see each other, even though we can't be in person with each other is so precious that we are being more mindful and more respectful of each other and hearing each other's words. I would also say, in terms of the ways that we have been creative as a family in creating spaces, we've had our own Zoom calls to check in, but we've also even had our own worship services as a family online and in a Zoom call. We've done everything that one would have in a typical worship service, because there's the whole brick and mortar thing we've taken for granted, that we can go to a church, we can go to a place to worship or just to be with each other. And here's the thing, what I believe will be so beautiful is think ahead a year and a half from now, when we are fully come out of this and we're able to touch each other, to connect with each other, to be in close distances to each other, and how precious that will be in just being able to do that again for the first time with community. And so as we can visualize that future, that we not take it for granted, how we can be with each other right now and just think so outside of the box. So those are some things that come to mind.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This is all just so rich, and I know that there are probably more questions that folks have on their minds, and so we want to try to take as many of those as we can. If you haven't already, please submit your questions in using the Q&A function. And I think Caitlin Tully is going to come back online with us and share a couple of those questions with us.
Yeah, great. So we had a couple good questions come in through the Q&A. The first one, I think, we touched a little bit in the conversation about what it means to sit in circle virtually, but one of our participants wants to know if we can offer a couple more specifics on what that looks like and how we can accomplish that in some more practical terms, especially something like when we're not physically present with one another. How do we deal with having, a talking piece, and other sort of practical applications of that?
Well, I'll say we've been within ACRJ, as I think I mentioned earlier, we are hosting community circles right now with folks. As a matter of fact, we had about 100 people come forward to be in circles of about 10 or 15 with folks. One of the opportunities that I get the honor of holding one of those circles. And I've been thinking a lot about it. What people do in order to be together, we have to think in terms of how we pass the talking piece. What we've asked people to do is bring their own talking piece to the circle. It's a way of people sharing what is important to them. And that's a way of people giving some introduction. One of the ways that we kind of acknowledge who goes in what order is by listing the names of everyone in the chat of say a Zoom call. We can list the names so there's an order. It also helps when people say the name of the next person who will receive the floor, because we don't have a talking piece that we can pass. But I think the biggest thing that I feel is important is the ways that we listen to each other by using the mute button. So if people are really mindful about that mute button, no one is interrupting anyone when they're speaking. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Technology, I think, can assist us, again, when we come out of this and we get into that next circle a year and a half or a year from now, we will appreciate the ways that we have been together in this, that it will teach us to be to really not interrupt each other, I think, going forward.
Awesome. Thank you. And I know that there are organizations and practitioners who are working to not only create, but also share kind of resources around kind of ways to do this well. And a few organizations who are starting to offer trainings, circle trainings virtually as well. So that's really exciting to see.
Yes.
Caitlin, do we have another question?
Sure. This is actually more of a comment, but it's also kind of spurring on some conversation in the chat bar. So I wanted to relay it to all of you and kind of get your perspectives. But Beatrice Vera commented that just make note of when we say people of color, we are also including brown people, not just Black or African Americans. She said, I feel we are frequently left out of our reflection. So I don't know if there's anything that either of you would like to chime in with regard to, you know, how the pandemic is affecting people of color of all different colors, and how specifically, you know, circle process and restorative practices can also address that.
I will say my experiences as an African American woman. I can't talk about this in ways of, I don't want to wash over people of color as a category, and I agree. I do believe that the people of color in this country are more marginalized. However, my experience is the one that I most closely connect to, is that of being African American and African American female. And I'll just say that I know for sure that we have heard the statistics about African Americans in the wake of COVID in the United States being the ones who are most highly impacted by COVID right now. And some of that has to do with location, some of that has to do with access to resources. And so in that way, that is my lived experience of my understanding of what this is and who I am as it relates to me.
And I will just add that in my experience as a white woman, that part of what this means for me is being able to recognize and name my privilege, and also identify the ways in which my responses can be, can prioritize those without some of the privileges that I have access to because of the systems that have contributed to our national state and realities, that in the ways that this disease is impacting all of us. So thank you, Caitlin. Other questions? Maybe one or two more?
Sure. This, I think, could be addressed and answered by either one of you, but there was a question about what aspects of your faith do you draw on in your practice of restorative justice?
I think for myself, I definitely talked about my connection to prayer. I feel like, yes, that would be the area that I pull from most often, and mainly because I don't have an excuse as to when I can pray, or how I can pray, or with whom I can pray. And so I try to be mindful of giving that space between what I know to be sure and what I don't know, and what the potential outcome of the situation is, to give that over. I have to pray.
And I think for me, right along with that, you know, we at Catholic Mobilizing Network think about and reflect a lot on how do the principles of restorative justice align with Catholic social tradition and its principles. And you know, there's more on that on our website if you want to see a little bit about that alignment. But first and foremost, just acknowledging and really grounding ourselves that every person has dignity, and that dignity deserves to be honored. And how do we create processes and responses and live in a way that upholds the dignity of every human person, meets their needs, and creates opportunities for healing and hope and living in a good way with one another. And so that groundedness in human dignity really shapes all that we do, and what our faith compels us, who our faith compels us to be in relationship with others. And there's so much that flows from there in terms of how do we think about what it means to repair harm in ways that honor the dignity of every person involved. So that's my 2 cents. Maybe one more, Caitlin?
Sure, I'm kind of gonna take the liberty of synthesizing a couple different points into one question, but I'm just wondering, we talked about what circle process can look like in this time virtually, but there are obviously there's wonderful creativity that's emerging from that, but there are also, of course, some challenges. So a couple that were just named in the chat were, there's a digital divide in our nation between, people who have access to some technologies and versus people who don't. So that's something that we kind of have to consider when we recommend virtual circles. But there are other more less practical challenges, more just the content of what's coming out in circle, that like the shared experience of COVID-19, just incredible losses that are happening, not just in individual communities, but across the country that are coming out in circle. So I'm just wondering if you could address either of those, whether it's a more practical challenge or more of what comes out in circle, the challenges of responding to that virtually. I think our attendees would love to hear.
I think I'm grateful for someone bringing up the whole digital divide comment, because I absolutely agree with you. There are people who do not have access, and even if they have devices, internet is a whole separate animal. I think that it's a time where, again, it's the ways that we who have privilege use our voice, use our resources to help in situations where people don't have certain things. We may be able to be a resource for someone to get access. Or if in the absence of that, we work with what we have. I even think about, we can't have circle in the traditional ways, but maybe there are ways that we can connect with people with the technology that they have, like just by phone. And there are ways that we can be with each other, and we can be creative just by hearing one another's voice and taking the pauses in between in order to just be with people. There are ways that we can do that. There are ways that we can be with each other from a distance in person. We just can't be right on each other. And I'm not asking anyone to break the law in their community, but there may be ways we can drive by. We can be in connection in a park, or some ways that we can be present with each other in order to hold space. I just think, again, it's about being creative and meeting people where they're at, and acknowledging what is not for people in as much as we acknowledge what is.
And I think all of this is reminding me of how, God willing, we won't be in this state forever, and it will end, and we will be able to be together in person, as you were saying earlier, what a blessed day that will be. And how do we step back into those more familiar communal settings in ways that are renewed, and possibly enter back into those spaces in a different way, because in this time we've been thinking about what restorative living means to us. And so I think, you know, with that, we want to honor your time and be respectful of other commitments. I know we're coming up on the hour. And so I guess we'll just say briefly that we encourage you to visit both of our websites. Wanted to mention, you know, a couple of resources, a few things you'll find based on Catholic Mobilizing Network's website, our Faith Formation Guide and Restorative Justice. Cheryl and I are both big fans of the Little Book of Restorative Justice by Howard Zehr, which has his fantastic 10 Ways to Live Restoratively is included in there. Wanted to highlight a Just Mercy Catholic Study Guide that Just Mercy is now streaming on, or is available on streaming platforms, and folks have been using the study guide to kind of watch and process the film together. And
that's a must-see.
As well as our Hope Over Death blog and action opportunities, particularly around opposing the death penalty, if you'd like to get more involved in that. So we wanted to conclude, we were talking earlier about ceremony and prayer, and wanted to close with a brief prayer kind of honoring this time. This was shared with me by a colleague from the Institute for Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience. And we invite you to move with us as well, because we know that our bodies are holding this stress. And actually, I skipped over something. So we are going to move into this prayer. And then Caitlin is also going to share a link to an evaluation that we'd love for you to fill out in the time immediately following the webinar. So I invite you to join me. Stand if you'd like, but it's totally up to you. So you can repeat after me. Lift our arms overhead, say, light of life, help me to be flexible and resilient. Help me to face the past. We bend over and shake our hands and let go of all that I need not carry. Thank you for life. So we thank you once again. Just before I forget, Caitlin did put the link to that evaluation in the chat. We invite you to click and fill that out as you're able. I want to say thank you again to Cheryl so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And thanks to all of you for being with us. We pray that you and your loved ones and your communities are safe and sustained and resilient in this time. Thank you. Peace and God bless.